Hi there. Do you know what this is? If you've purchased a TV in the last 15-ish years or so, or if you're rocking a streaming device of some sort, odds are you've seen this connection at some point. It's called the High Definition Multimedia Interface, or HDMI for short, and it's been with us since about 2003 or so. Over those years, the standard itself has seen a number of updates that have added new features and capabilities, but the most recent upgrade, version 2.1, adds some nifty new tricks that might be of interest to anyone who likes to stay on the bleeding edge of display technology, including anyone out there eyeing the next generation consoles like the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. So if you've been interested in a new high-end TV and are hoping to future-proof your purchase as much as possible, this week's topical deep dive might be helpful. These are 5 things you should know about HDMI 2.1. Number 1. Well, what's so special about HDMI 2.1? Okay, we're going to start with the basics. So HDMI here, it's been the standard connection for high-definition televisions for years and years now, and version 2.1 is just another update to the standard that brings along some fancy new features that honestly, you may or may not care about, depending on what you want to use your TV for. So here are some of the highlights that HDMI 2.1 brings to the table. Support for higher resolutions and faster frame rates. And by that, I mean things like 8K TVs, which are starting to come to the market, and even 10K TVs, which are slightly more exotic to say the least. And higher frame rate support means more frames per second at those higher resolutions, which can come in handy for, say, video games that support high frame rates. Dynamic HDR. So we went over the basics of HDR or high dynamic range video in an earlier topical deep dive, but essentially, HDR offers up more range between the darkest and lightest portions of a scene, allowing for more depth and detail. And dynamic HDR builds upon that ability by adjusting the minimum and maximum levels on a frame-by-frame or scene-by-scene basis. In theory, it should allow for even more depth and detail than static HDR. Variable refresh rate. Now this one could be especially useful to gamers, but in a nutshell, variable refresh rate allows the TV or monitor to better stay in sync with a PC's or video game console's graphics chip. It basically tells the TV to wait until the graphics chip is done drawing a frame before that frame gets displayed. And without getting too technical, the benefit there is potentially smoother gameplay and fewer jarring frame rate hitches or instances where the image on screen seems to briefly tear a bit. Auto low latency mode. This one's another game-friendly addition. So your TV usually adds some sort of processing effects to whatever's on screen. Those effects might result in a sharper picture or better color, but they tend to take up time. And that just increases latency, or the time between when you input a command and when that command registers on screen. So auto low latency mode aims to avoid those effects and improve your gameplay experience. Some modern TVs might have a dedicated game mode that aims to achieve similar results, but auto low latency mode, as you might guess, looks to do this on the fly. And there are other perks like quick media switching and quick frame transport, but I think we've covered the key highlights here. It's also important to note that this isn't a software update. So in order to get these nifty new features, you're going to need a TV with HDMI 2.1 ports built in. They'll look the same as current HDMI ports, but they'll support even higher bandwidth. Also, if you want to take full advantage of what 2.1 offers, you'll need to buy some new cables too. But we'll get into why you can wait on that in just a moment. Now, the 2.1 update itself has been around for a couple of years, but it's really started to gain traction here in 2020. That kicked off with a selection of new TVs at the 2020 CES, or Consumer Electronics Show, in Las Vegas. We started to see a handful of new models boasting the new standard, with the idea being that many of them would be released later this year. And well, it's later this year. And we're also quickly approaching the arrival of a potentially big selling point for HDMI 2.1. And that's the launch of next-generation video game consoles from Sony and Microsoft. Number 2. How will next-gen game consoles use the new features? So yeah, if you haven't heard by now, we've got some fancy high-powered video game consoles coming to market in just a few weeks by this point, and understandably both Microsoft and Sony are touting some forward-looking features their consoles can support. The idea there is that it's a lot easier to justify paying hundreds of dollars to replace your current and still pretty good game console if these new devices offer up something new that wasn't possible earlier. So yes, both the next-gen Xbox consoles and PlayStation 5 are touting support for up to 8K resolution gaming, 120 frames per second, variable refresh rate, and more. Now, will every game you play on these new systems run at 8K resolution or 120 frames per second? No, they absolutely will not, at least not across the board. Will we eventually see games that support features like 8K? Well, yeah, but it'll depend on the game itself, how complex it is, and other factors. Generally speaking, the more graphically and computationally complex a game is, the harder it is to display that game at higher and higher resolutions and at faster frame rates. But we'll likely see some examples of 8K gaming in the near future. Meanwhile, 120 frames per second support will become more prevalent as well. High frame rates have been a thing on PCs for years and years now, so there are definitely ways to get current and future games running at those high frame rates. In fact, we've already heard of some upcoming games that will sport 120 frames per second modes. Odds are those modes will cut down on some graphical bells and whistles here and there to hit those frame rates, but they are coming to consoles. And in case you're wondering what's so important about 120 frames per second, well, it comes down to smoothness and, for some folks, advantages high frame rates provide in competitive gaming. In general, it's easier to track targets, aim more accurately, and more at those higher frame rates, so seeing support for 120 frames per second should entice more serious competitive gamers as well, especially if they have a TV that can support those kind of frame rates. Of course, Microsoft and Sony aren't touting 8K, 120 frames per second, or variable refresh rates just to get you excited about what their consoles can do today. They're trying to get you hyped up for what's possible in the future, especially when more and more HDMI 2.1 compliant TVs are on the market and more affordable. Number 3. Do I absolutely need HDMI 2.1 for these new consoles? No. No, 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 no. No. If you have a fairly modern TV, you'll be able to enjoy Xbox Series S and X and PlayStation 5 games just fine. In fact, the more affordable and lower-priced Xbox Series S might actually be ideal for older 1080p sets and other non-4K displays. And some current TVs already support 120 frames per second just at lower than 4K resolutions. So if you're fine with that kind of trade-off, you might still be able to enjoy high frame rates with your existing TVs, depending on its specs. And even if you think you'll want those HDMI 2.1 features at some point, it might be worth waiting until TV support is more common and widespread. For one thing, more options and competition should lead to lower prices for a good HDMI 2.1 TV. And like with many fancy new features, some companies will add support more tentatively to start. For example, some of the HDMI 2.1 TVs that we're starting to see this year only support the new standard on one of their ports, while the other HDMI connections rely on the older standard. So if you're going to be in a multi-console household, it might be worth waiting until more models come out that support more than one 2.1 connection. And just because a given TV model has HDMI 2.1 on board, that doesn't necessarily mean its fancy new features like variable refresh rate will work just as well as that same feature on other TVs. Like any new standard, it's probably going to take manufacturers some time to get really good at implementing these new features. So the bottom line is you absolutely, positively do not need to have HDMI 2.1 TVs to enjoy these upcoming game consoles. However, if you really, really want one, we have some suggestions for you. Number 4. What if I really want an HDMI 2.1 TV right now? Okay, first off, if you skipped right to this section via that nifty timestamp link in the video description down below, I strongly recommend you take a peek at the section right before this one, where we go into why you really don't have to have an HDMI 2.1 TV for these new consoles. I just want you to know that waiting to upgrade, or not upgrading at all, is totally and completely fine. But if you got your pre-orders in and you want to access those cool new features ASAP, here are some recommendations based on what's on the market at the moment. So at the high end, we have OLED TVs, like LG's CX line. Now, whether you're gaming, using a streaming device, or watching a 4K Blu-ray disc, OLED displays typically offer some of the best image quality you can get today. And several of LG's current models offer HDMI 2.1 support in case you need a new gaming display right now. However, there have been reports of users having issues with the variable refresh rate, causing certain areas to look more gray and washed out than normal. And that can be annoying since one of the main reasons to buy an OLED display is for the superior image quality. And as of now, LG is reportedly looking into ways to address the issue. Also, owners of Nvidia's new graphics cards have reported some issues with LG's CX line, and the company is working to fix those issues as well. So a great TV overall, but just a heads up about some potential issues in certain use cases. As for non-OLED TVs, Samsung's 2020 Q80T is a solid choice. You get very low latency in game mode and variable refresh rate too. It does lack Dolby Vision HDR support, and the 49-inch model is also missing a lot of the forward-looking features of its bigger screen siblings. So if you're looking at the Q80T, I'd aim for the 55-incher or larger. And Sony's X900H is another feature-rich option that could potentially be a good fit for gamers. In fact, Sony declares that the X900H is officially, and I quote, ready for PlayStation 5. And those same features like variable refresh rate or auto low latency mode should make it a great fit for the Xbox Series X and S as well. However, and this one's important, those cool HDMI 2.1 features are still listed as coming soon via firmware update. And as of the recording of this video, we haven't heard exact dates on when those features will be coming to Sony's TV. Now, it would not shock me one bit to see those features sneak in just in time for the launch of the Xbox and PS5 in early November, but I just want to make sure you're aware that those features are still TBD as of right now. Number 5. Should I buy an HDMI 2.1 TV right now? Honestly, that's entirely up to you, your current needs, and how much you value what HDMI 2.1 brings to the table. If you love living on the absolute bleeding edge of new tech, then I certainly won't stop you. But I think for most folks, the best strategy here is to wait until more HDMI 2.1 TVs come to market. As we said earlier, more options and more competition should lead to better pricing. And plus, it could be worth waiting until various TV makers really get a handle on how best to implement those fancy new features. That said, if you're looking to invest in a new TV right now, maybe have a look at our recommendations in the earlier section if you're interested in future-proofing your purchase just a bit. And that's about it for this week's Topical Deep Dive. As always, I thank you all for tuning in, and we'd appreciate it if you clicked on those like and subscribe buttons down below. Every Wednesday, Jess hosts a live Q&A session with our readers and viewers, and on Fridays, we wrap up the week in cord-cutting and streaming news. And in between, we dive into specific topics like, say, HDMI 2.1. For now, though, my name's Philip Palermo. Thanks again for watching. Take care.